The code for the Nearpod, VDEPH, if we jump into there, we're talking now about economic growth. Economic growth being the macroeconomic objective, the thing that we are desiring our government to provide for us, the thing that is going to help maybe reduce unemployment, right? The thing that's going to build our standard of living, that economic growth idea that may give us a measure for how successful our economy is over time, and also potentially, no worries, Imran, also potentially issues economic growth can be used to compare different countries with other countries, right? So with that in mind, here's a big question for you. Now this might involve a little bit of asking of Dr. Google, but I saw a growth rate. It came up just the other day, yesterday, may have even been this morning, I'm sure, all right? And it was the growth rate for India. Here's what I'd like you to do. Just a quick Google search for me, please. What is the current economic growth rate for India? See if you can figure that out. And as you do that, just chuck it into the chat. I'd like you to try and imagine why it is that particular rate. What does that rate tell you? Because that's the next step. We know what the economic growth is. We then need to know what is it telling us. Well done, Abu. Absolutely. India had a growth rate just the other day, maybe this morning, I'm sure, of 20.1%. That's not 1%, that's not 2%, that's 20%. Now, that's a number that's pretty astronomical. Right? If your economy is growing at 20%, that's huge, that's very fast, that's lightning fast. But is it really? Why do you think it is growing so fast right at the moment? What's currently happening, or what has currently happened in India, that might mean that this is actually a sensible growth rate for India? What do we think? Have just an idea as to why India might be experiencing 20% growth. What do we think? Inflation? Yeah, maybe. There might be elements of inflation within it. Yes, good work, Hong. A lot of businesses opening. Absolutely. Why? What's been going on in the world and going on specifically in India? Not necessarily to do with the costs. Why aren't we in school at the moment? Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that the global pandemic has done is it has reduced economic growth for a lot of countries. A lot of countries have actually seen really, really significant decreases in their economic growth, to the extent where they're now starting from such a low point that to get back to sort of somewhere near normal, they've actually got to make a big jump. So that's what's happened with India. India has actually made a big jump, right? But the reason why they were able to make such a ginormous big leap with regards to economic growth was because the pandemic had actually knocked their economy really, 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 really far down. So in order to get kind of back onto the normal plane, they've actually had to jump really high. So that's why their percentage looks really incredible, because they're actually starting from a very low point. All right. Now, this is what's happening around the world. You will notice not that long ago, America had a growth rate of around 6%. For America, that's very fast. Okay, very fast for America. The reason why it is because, again, because of the pandemic, their economy was, right, their growth rate was impacted quite significantly. All right. Now, let's think a little bit more in depth about this idea of economic growth. How do we measure it? What do we see? We see economic growth as being the increase in real GDP. So that GDP calculation that you worked on the other week, this is what we're going to use as our measure of economic growth. So we've got the objective, we want economic growth, we want the living standards that come with it, so we need to see that increase in real GDP. It's going to manufacture for us more goods and services, and that's then our standard of living. We've got the latest and greatest and fanciest, and right, we've got all of these things. There was on the TV the other day, there was a flying car somebody has invented. I don't know why you'd want a flying car, but they've invented a flying car. Yeah? The new standards of living resulting from economic growth. More goods and services able to be consumed. We do have to be a bit specific when we're talking about economic growth. We need to talk about what's called long-run economic growth. So economic growth that doesn't occur immediately, but economic growth that takes time to occur. Then we need to think about short-run economic growth. Short-run economic growth can occur immediately. It's just an improvement. So what we see is we see an improvement in economic growth in the short run. And that's where we're moving from point A to point B. We're moving from inside the PPC curve to closer to the limit of the PPC. Okay? That means that we had inefficiency, we had an underutilization of resources, but because we've gone through some productivity changes, because we're now working cleverer with our resources, whatever we're doing, we're actually able to make gains, improvements in productivity, improvements in growth, but it's only in the short term. If we are to see the increase in what is possible to produce, that is the long term. So that comes about because we may have discovered more of our resources. We've dug in the background here, in the backyard of Nexus, and drilled for oil. Right? More economic growth. We may have invented new computers and robots and technologies that help us. And if you haven't kept up with the news, you might be aware that the Tesla company, they're looking at producing a robot. Now, that's their next challenge, apparently. They're going to produce humanoid robots. Why they need to be humanoid, I'm not sure. But they're going to produce humanoid robots to work in people's houses as, assistants in your house. Okay? Cleaning, cooking, whatever it is that you're wanting them to do. And one of the selling points that Tesla is saying with regards to these robots is that they are you're going to be able to run away from them, or you're going to be able to overpower them if there are any problems with them. That kind of doesn't really sound like a selling point to me. But right. New technology, long-run economic growth. Maybe we get more labour. Okay? And we get labour by maybe more immigration coming into the country. Maybe we get better labour, so the quality aspect of labour. So they become more educated, more skilled, more efficient. Right? Like you all, right, doing all your training that you're doing, and you're getting better and better and better at the particular skills that you're learning. Right? And then, therefore, long-run economic growth, able to perform better in the economy. Yeah? Right. So two types of economic growth, both illustrated by a PPC. How do we get there? One of the key ways that we achieve economic growth is through investment. And there it is. If we spend more on capital goods in particular, okay, we should see that increase in growth. Right? We should see that long-run increase in growth. So it should be infrastructure spending, like what we're seeing in the United States, and it's trillions of dollars that they're spending in the United States. General machinery that we use inside factories, or just the factories themselves. Excuse me, getting a bit phlegmy, right? And we've seen that. We've seen videos of the warehouses using robots for deliveries and organisation. You've seen drone delivery systems. You've seen robots being used in hotels, robots being used in hospitals. Yeah. There was an article I read the other day that suggested that you could train AI, and if you give it a specific framework for it to use, so say for example, economic syllabus, you give it the framework, it can then teach the course. Right? So it was a debate amongst economists about whether AI would replace teachers, right, by basically machine learning the AI system. Right. Now, there is a graph. Now, this graph is showing you time periods when we have discovered natural resources. Now, this is something that, again, you're probably not as familiar with. But if you look at the time periods there, and you see a huge growth in discovery of natural resources in and around the 50s and 60s. That kind of makes sense to us when we consider the history of the world, what was happening at that sort of a time. Right? We'd finished the Second World War, the entire world was going through a massive expansion, a really big growth phase, and part of that was driven by the discovery of oil. Now, admittedly, we haven't been discovering as much oil and resources, right, into the 21st century, right? But they're now using new technologies. You will have heard about fracking and various other things to try and get deeper and into different places and all of that to discover more of these natural resources. Technological progress. Again, this is something that you are familiar with because you live in it. Right? You live in an age of cell phones and internet use. You live in an age when all of these sorts of things are possible. The remote learning, the AI, the AR, VR, all of those things happen now. Yeah? Whereas before weren't even considered. Right? So things there on the list like biotechnology, wind and solar power, electric cars, and now self-driving cars. They had an aeroplane on the Discovery Channel the other night, and it had like a transparent roof. Right, so it's flying up in the sky, and then it just makes the roof transparent. So when you fly, you can just look up and see the clouds in the sky. Not sure why, but apparently that's a new technology that they are working on. But this has all happened. I mean, you think about the development of refrigeration, the development of refrigerating meats, right, in particular, so that you're able to make trade, right, much further distances. Your product is able to go much further distances. You're able to make more money, bigger markets, all of those sorts of ideas. All of that technological change has led to economic growth. We can also think, as said, about the quantity and the quality of our labour. So our education. Right now, we are in an international school. I'd say we're virtually, okay. But there are a whole range of different ideas as to how you can organise education. What should education be? And now that we're doing this virtual learning, maybe your education needs to be packaged, and it needs to be complete these tasks and get a certificate and get it online and have a digital portfolio that records your progress. And if you do any online courses, that's the kind of approach that they have now. So maybe that's where education is going. Maybe that's what we need now to be more productive, that sort of approach. The gamification idea that I've been, trialing a little bit of before the pandemic, where you're awarded essentially badges per individual segment that you have learned. So you build up a progress, a portfolio again of achievements that you've unlocked. Healthcare and productivity to do with healthcare. People being healthier, living longer, being more fit and healthy, being able to complete their tasks and their jobs better, easier, for longer. Birth rates, right? More labour simply because there's more children, more people, right? Something China has discovered, right? That their one-child policy has led to some quite significant issues, and that they're now trying desperately to increase their population size. Immigration, more people moving to different countries. Now, quite clearly, we're an international school, so there is immigration that has been occurring with us. So all of these contribute to the quality of labour. Right? All of these have an impact on how productive the labour force is, and therefore the potential for economic growth going into the future. We can also do some reallocation of resources. We could move some resources that were previously just being used to produce consumer goods to being produced capital goods. These are things that we've talked about, particularly when we discussed the PPC curve. If we move those, then in the future, the increase in capital goods is going to allow us to produce more consumer goods. So therefore economic growth. Right? So that sort of reallocation, reprioritizing can lead to longer term growth. We could also do this idea, now apologies for the images here, right, where we have less productive use of resources transformed into a more productive use of resources. So that idea that you're inside the PPC curve and you're moving towards the limit of the PPC. We know the inefficiencies, we can see them. Right? We know that it is more efficient to do things one way or another, and that would then free up time. Yeah? And as said, I mentioned to you right at the start in your year 10 year when we were talking about labour and the uses of labour, and I said that in China when we lived there, there would be people who would go and they would sweep the streets, right, removing the dust and the rubbish from the street. And then behind them would come a massive big street sweeping machine, right, to complete the job. Now the reason why both were in operation was because the government had decided it wanted to have zero unemployment. But the street sweeping machine would be much more efficient than the people. So having more productive uses of the resources that we have. We need to be aware, and this is what I was hinting at earlier with regards to India, that it is possible to have negative economic growth. It is possible to have your economy actually decrease in size. And the PPC curve that you see on the slide there, shifting inwards, right? Less being possible to be produced. All right? So when we're thinking about that, we're talking about maybe they've gone through a war or a global pandemic, right? And your economy has actually shrunken, right? There is less able to be produced. Right, now, ladies and gentlemen, there's a little thing here for us to look at. All right, now this is a company that we've talked about before. It is the Marginal Revolution University. Right? They produce some what's called everyday economics. They have a website that you can go to, and in the website they will have videos and worksheets and explainers and all sorts of things. They're not targeting it at IGCSE economics. It is just economics. So a lot of the material that they cover will actually be above you. It might be set at IB level, A level, university level. Right? So just be aware of that if you do go through their site and their material, that some of it is actually pitched a little bit higher than what is needed for you. So let's have a look and see why economic growth is really important.
In our last video, we covered the surprisingly large differences in living standards between countries. But how did we get to where we are? How did these differences come about? Now we're going to dive into growth rates. We're going to see how they affect prosperity. So this graph shows real GDP per capita in the United States since 1800. But let's just give a word of interpretation. A 1% increase from a base of 100, that's 1. But a 1% increase from a base of 1,000, that's 10. So a graph like this can make it seem as if the economy is growing at a faster and faster rate. Actually, all that's really going on here is a change in the base, in the size of the economy. So to handle this issue, we're going to change the graph to a ratio scale. This will help us to see growth rates a little bit more clearly. Now each tick is a double. So here we go from 1,000 to 2,000, now 2,000 to 4,000, and so forth. The nice thing about these graphs is that a straight line means a line of constant growth. So for example, here's GDP per capita in the United States in 1845. It was around $2,000. 35 years later, in 1880, it had doubled to 4,000. So we know immediately, right, from the rule of 70, that the growth rate over this period was about 2% per year. So the lesson from this graph is that the most basic reason that the United States is wealthy is simply that it's grown consistently for a long period of time. We can also use this graph to do something neat. We can look at other countries today and place them in US history. For example, here's Bangladesh and Uganda, both of which have a real GDP per capita today, which is about the same as the United States had in 1800. Here's India, with a real GDP per capita today, about the same as the United States had in 1880. Here's China, about the GDP per capita of the United States during the Roaring 20s. But remember, India and China, they're growing really rapidly. So anything I say today is going to be a little bit off tomorrow. They're catching up. Here's Italy. It has a GDP per capita today, which is about what the United States had around 1980. I remember 1980, I got an Atari. It was pretty good, life was good. So life in Italy is pretty good. Of course, these comparisons, they're imperfect. One reason is especially interesting. Every country in the world today has a greater life expectancy than even the richest countries had in 1800. And that's because poor countries have benefited from spillovers from growth in the rich countries. Things like the eradication of diseases like smallpox, the creation of antibiotics, improvements in the scientific understanding of sanitation. So even countries which haven't grown in GDP per capita, they are a lot better off in other ways because of spillovers from the rich countries. So these comparisons, yeah, they're imperfect. But I do think they can still give us some intuition for living standards in other countries, and also for how steady growth improves living standards. So real GDP per capita in the United States, it's doubled about every 35 to 40 years. And over several generations, it's this steady growth which results in monumental increases in the standard of living. If things had been different, if the United States had grown more slowly, for example, suppose it had grown by, let's say, 1% per year since 1800, then GDP per capita today would be much lower, about what we had in 1940. Now remember, in 1940, hardly anybody has a car, they're just getting out of the Great Depression, they're about to go to war, World War II, no televisions. People in 1940 were pretty poor. In fact, the average person in 1940 had an income that today would put them below the poverty level. On the other hand, if the growth rate had been higher, suppose it had been 3% per year, then we would have hit our current living standards in 1917. And if we continued at that rate, then today we'd have a real GDP per capita level of $893,000. That would have been pretty nice. At current rates of growth, we're going to have to wait until 2159 before we hit that level. I'm probably not going to make it, unfortunately. Unless, of course, we can find some way of increasing our growth rate. So the lesson here is clear. It's that even small changes in growth rates have really big effects when they're sustained over time. You might wonder, why did it take so long for growth in real GDP per capita to really get going? Why didn't it happen before the 1800s? why didn't the Industrial Revolution, why didn't it happen in 1200 or 1200 BC for that matter? That's a really important question. And in our next video from Everyday Economics with John Boudreau, he's going to take a look at some of the potential answers and some of the mysteries behind that deep and important question.
If you want to test yourself, click Practice.
All right. So, as said, Marginal Revolution University, they've got a website, they've got Everyday Economics that they produce. They have a whole series of videos on different topics and worksheets and the like. And yet, feel free, but do be aware that they will go above and beyond what is needed for your syllabus. Right? But if you are wanting to expand your knowledge about individual aspects of the course, they're a really good one to have a go at. Right, so the idea here is that economic growth rates, if they are consistent and maintained, are going to lead to big increases in the standard of living. So when you see small changes in those growth rates, like the 1% sort of idea that was mentioned, then that is going to potentially, if it is maintained, lead to quite big, quite dramatic effects in the long run. Here's your question. When is it easiest to grow fast? Right? Is it easier to get that higher growth rate when your GDP is already high, or is it easier to get the higher growth rate when you're starting from a lower level? Right? Our conversation earlier might perhaps help with this. Just chuck an answer into the chat. What do you think? Is it easier to achieve a high percentage of growth if you're starting at a low level with GDP, or if you're starting at a higher level? Look at the map of the world there, you're seeing some pretty interesting statistics. Having a look at the annual percentage change. Right. The yellow figures, or the dark orange figures here, 10% or more. This colour, which is slightly less, 6 to 10%. This colour, 3 to 6%. So all of these countries around here, with those figures, then the greens here, 0 to 3%, and then this green, less than 0%. So countries in and around here with the less than 0%, and then some of these countries with 0 to 3%. What did we come up with? Maybe a little country might not have good education. Yes, okay. Yeah, all right. Okay, so let's think. Has anybody done running races, like where you've had to sprint? Anybody done sprint races? You know, for like 100 meters? No idea. Yep, a couple of hands. Okay. If you are running in a running race, do you think it's easier to get up to speed right from the start? Or do you think it would be easier if you had like a distance that you could gradually get up to speed, right, and then really run? What do you think? Don't know that my analogy is helpful as I thought it might be. Do you think you can run faster if you had a space to pick up speed before everybody else and then run, or if everybody starts from the same place and then runs? In which area do you think you'd run faster? You might have run in a relay race, potentially, I don't know, in the past, and you might be aware of how relay runners run. You might have been watching the Olympics in Tokyo and seen that what happens is that the runner who's going to hand you the baton is running towards you, but rather than you just stand stock still to get the baton, you actually have to start running first and get a bit of speed up. And then they catch you, and then you pass you the baton, and then you just run. Yeah? The point I'm kind of labouring at here, which apologies for the analogy that may not quite land, all right, is that just as the case with India that we talked about earlier, or the cases that we look at here on the map, you're going to see countries here that are actually starting from a lower level. Right, so some of the countries in Africa, obviously China and India, countries in Asia, might have actually started at a lower level of GDP. And then the gap for them to run is bigger, so they're able to make bigger gains, right, from that. So China has grown at 10% a year for a while. Right. It has only relatively recently lost part of that, and part of that is the pandemic. It's still, I believe, growing at around 6% per year. Right, might be down into the 5%. That's still really fast. Right, when you consider a lot of the rest of the world, which is growing at 0 to 3% or less. So that average annual increase in GDP, right, that growth rate for a lot of those countries, right, it is easier for them to grow faster for longer if they start from a very low level to start with. So the United States, remember that graph that we saw with regards to technological development, resources being gained, a lot of those sorts of time periods were periods in history where there wasn't a lot of economic development to start with. There wasn't a lot of growth. So they were able to make big gains. Yeah? Right, so for a developing country, something as simple as paving the roads, developing the infrastructure, all of that is big investments. All of that is investments in capital goods. Even just providing the internet. Yeah? Remember Google was trying to work out, was it Google? I think it was Google, Alphabet, was trying to work out how to get the internet around all of Africa. And they were talking about having hot air balloons floating over Africa so that, it would be able to bounce the internet signal off of the hot air balloon. I don't know if you remember that. They've since abandoned this idea, but it was a way to help the development and the growth of Africa in particular, or countries within Africa, by having these floating internet stations, basically. All right, new healthcare, more education, they contribute vastly to the rate of growth. Okay, one of the big things I read about, this is going back a few years ago, is that the best investment you can make with regards to infrastructure is roading. right? Being able to move your goods and services from one part of the country to another. That's a huge development, growth-related investment. All right. Now, this will be, I think, one of the last things that we think about for today, right? And then we'll pick up again next time. All right. Have a look at this graph here, and the question is up there. It says, do the growth rates for countries correlate? Are they related to each other? Do they move the same way? And if they do, why do you think they do that? So have a look at the graph. It's on your screen as well. Right, we've got countries like Spain, Germany, the United States, Italy, the United Kingdom. So the first thing is, do you think the rates of growth of these countries follow each other? And then why do you think they might follow each other? Have a go. Just put your answer into the chat. All right, some good thinking going on, I see. What do they relate to each other? Do they follow each other? And why do we think that they follow each other? What's going on? Helps if you look at the actual countries mentioned. That helps. Chuck an answer into the chat, what you think. Okay, yes, some good thinking there. And when you look at the data here, I mean, yeah, there are some differences, but overall, you would suggest that they do actually follow each other. Okay, and it's not an uncommon thing for this to happen. Right? If you look at the actual countries, Spain, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, where are they all based? What part of the world do they all live in? Europe, yeah. And they're all countries that, I mean, yes, I know there's a little bit of water between the UK and the rest of Europe, right? But more or less, they're all next door neighbours to each other, kind of like Malaysia and Singapore, okay? So there is going to be trade between those countries, and there's going to be trading agreements, trading deals between them. All right, well done, team. So because of that, as one country does better, they're going to trade more with the other country. And then that country will do better, and they will trade more with the other countries. And it becomes a bit of a wave, Each country doing better impacts on the other countries. I mean, this period in history, you might be familiar with this. That's 2008, all right, when we had a global financial crisis. And all of these countries suffered with regards to their economic growth, right? And it's that same idea. One country suffers, it then means it can't buy the goods and services from another country, which means that country suffers, so it can't buy the goods and services from the other country. And it becomes like one of those sort of chain reactions. Yeah? Okay. In the United States, you remember the GDP graph that we had. This is going back a few days now. But the United States, we'd worked out, was contributing to around about a quarter of the world's entire GDP. Right? So therefore, when the US suffers, the rest of the world will as well. Okay, we used to have an expression, this is going back a long time ago when I was at university, so that is a very long time ago, and the expression that we used was when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches the cold. Now obviously at the moment, with pandemics and all, that's a bit of an unfortunate expression. But that's what we used to see. In the economic data, what happens to America tends to happen to the rest of the world. Right, so 2008, it happened, right? Here we've got a drop-off here around 2012, 2013, right? And if this was to keep going in here and into the 20s, 2020, you would see that decline again, and they will all follow each other as well. So yes, countries' growth rates will relate to each other. There is a lot of, and the word that we use, there is a lot of interdependence between the countries. Right? They buy their natural resources from each other. They sell goods and services to each other. We're part of a global market. So there is a lot of reliance on that country doing well in order for us to do well. Yeah? Think of the relationship, if the Europe one is baffling, think of the relationship between Malaysia and Singapore. How much investment there's been in Malaysia from Singapore, right? How Malaysia has related to Singapore and the Singaporean economy, right? And you kind of get the overall idea with regards to it. All right, now team, we're going to finish there, and that will give you a break. I would like you to have a bit of downtime from the screen so that you're not all, right, by the end of the day, and all, what are the term we use? Zoom fatigue, even though it's not Zoom, it's meat fatigue. Now, what would be a useful thing for you to do, please, is to review the lessons, right? Make sure you've gone through the material, go through the practice questions, etc., and finish any of those off that you haven't yet done. Look through any feedback I've given you, make sure you're understanding it all. Email questions quite clearly. I will upload the video of the recording of the lesson, and you can then work your way back through it. You can add depth to your notes, okay, from them. You can also look up, obviously, the mock exam website that you've got access to, right, the revision one. You can be continuing your revision build-up, and this is a really significant thing for you to do, to actually work solidly on your RAG, your red, amber, green. Right, to look at those specific learning objectives and say, this one I really don't know. This one I'm okay with, I just need to refresh on that. This one I'm an expert in, so I don't need to spend a lot of time revising the green. I do need to spend some time revising the amber, but I need some help with the red. Right? And you can separate your revision up into the red, ambers, and the greens. You can start pulling those specific learning objectives out, adding notes to them, adding resources, right, from the site, web links, video links, to try and help you understand that specific learning objective. Now, it's a very effective revision technique, right? And then after that, you tend to practice a question relating to that, a purposeful question relating to that specific learning objective. And that will help you then get the full grasp of what it is you need before the mock exams. But you need to be doing that sort of idea bit by bit, okay, and starting to do that from now so that you don't end up with the situation. Yes, not all slides are on the website. I have put, if we're talking about the mock exam website, then I've put specific slides on the website, all right? The other slides that there are, because there are a lot, okay, they will be on different sites, say the Unit 1 website, the Unit 2 website, the Unit 3 website, and so on. There will be slides in those, and there are some that are just too new that haven't even been added to sites yet, like the one that I'm going through with you now. That one I can PDFize and put up into the classroom so you can have access to, say, this one, for example, and the GDP one would be a good one, right, for macro. But as said, do it in bite-sized chunks. Try not to leave yourself so that you're doing everything at the last minute, because that's not an effective way, an efficient way, a productive way for you to actually manage your revision or your time. Right? And also we need to think very carefully about those of you who are needing to write on computers as opposed to handwriting. Right? So your strategies with regards to revision need to include typing of answers, right? But you typing the answer, not you asking Dr. Google for the answer. Right? You coming up with a typed answer and then checking that answer either through the Dr. Googles or me, right? Just make sure that you're on the right path with that. Right? Okay, team. Otherwise, as we'd say in the land of my birth, hey kōnera, which means goodbye for now. I'll post the things into the classroom as they come out. Otherwise, yes, we'll see you next time. Have a fantastic day.